So I am Catherine, and I will be discussing the feminine imagination in post-war cinema. So let's get started. As recently as 6 years ago in 2019, only 13% of working Hollywood screenwriters were women. By contrast, in 1947, over 25% of members of the Screenwriters Guild were women. Women have been a cornerstone of the film industry, both here in the UK and in the US in Hollywood, since the industry's very beginnings, whether that be behind the camera as writers, editors, even occasionally as directors and producers, in front of the camera as actresses who have been some of the highest paid and most recognizable faces of their day, or perhaps most critically as audiences. It is not my intention with this presentation to represent the post-war film industry as some kind of feminist utopia, but what I do hope to achieve is to highlight the presence of women working in film during this period and examine how the influence of women as creative figures is relevant to the way we analyze and interpret post-war cinema today. For this presentation, I'll be looking specifically at examples from the melodrama genre, which emerged during the Second World War as an evolution from the romantic comedies and historical romances that dominated the box office in the pre-war 1930s. At the time and in subsequent critical literature, the melodrama is a genre that's very much associated with women. Not only were they the intended target audience, but also the genre is characterized by female protagonists, a prevalence of domestic settings, and a focus on themes that would have been deemed traditionally feminine, such as family and romance. I will be looking at three pertinent examples of the classic melodrama, which featured women heavily in their production, and I will be analyzing key plot points through the lens of their being the creations of the feminine imagination. The first film I will be looking at is Now Voyager, the only film we'll be looking at today, which was produced while the war was still ongoing. An early melodrama based on the novel by Olive Higgins Prouty. The film starred Bette Davis in the lead role as Charlotte. Davis was something of a powerhouse in Hollywood at the time. Known for having a great deal of influence behind the camera as well as in front. With Now Voyager specifically, not only did she have the final say in the casting of her co-stars, including the male lead, she also handpicked the director, who she felt would be able to honor the female perspective of the story. The film ends with the characters Charlotte and her love interest Jerry agreeing to remain platonic in light of the fact that he's married. However, Charlotte does end up taking under her wing and sort of unofficially adopting Jerry's troubled teenage daughter Tina. The ending of the film is somewhat controversial and can come across as quite forced and convoluted, particularly from a modern perspective, but it is important to understand how this ending would have been understood by the audience at the time, particularly a female audience. Now Voyager uses the language of film to circumvent censorship laws that would have been in place at the time to limit how topics that would have been seen as taboo, such as female sexuality and infidelity, could be portrayed on screen. With this ending, the film is able to portray Charlotte's journey, emotional journey, going from a repressed, anxious young woman into a confident, self-assured woman who comes into her own sexually and emotionally without the pressure from the censors to show her as being shamed or punished in some way, as was sometimes necessitated. Additionally, through their shared connection with Tina, it can be interpreted through the cinematic language of implication and suggestion that this ending is a way for Charlotte and Jerry to be together in spirit, so to speak. Additionally, taking the ending a bit more literally, it would have been groundbreaking for women in the audience at the time to see this story depicted on screen of a woman who experiences this great passion with a man and then comes out the other side realizing she doesn't really need him, or indeed any man, ending the film as a financially independent woman who owns her own home, lives by herself, and finds her own agency and empowerment in a domestic setting through the role of a single mother to an older child who she has chosen to live with herself. The second film I want to discuss is The Seventh Veil, released in 1945, shortly after the end of the war, co-written by married couple Muriel and Sidney Box, who won the Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay. The broad ideas for the plot and characters are generally attributed to Muriel. The film was controversial even at the time and continues to be so, primarily for its central romance between the characters Francesca and Nicholas, largely due to the fact that Nicholas is characterized as controlling and domineering. But the film was one of the highest grossing British films the year of its release, and largely due to an overwhelmingly female audience. So why would a female writer create such a relationship dynamic, and why would women flock to the cinema to see it? I would argue that the key to understanding The Seventh Veil is to interpret it not so much as a literal scenario of a controlling man telling a woman what to do, and more an emotional fantasy of a woman who is able to achieve her desires without the perceived shame or indignity of having to ask for it. In the post-war period, when men were returning from the war front and trying to pressure women into returning to their pre-war domestic roles, here instead is a scenario where a man is insisting that Francesca go to university, pursue an education, go to have a prosperous career where she gets to travel the world and makes a lot of money, far more than he ever did. For women in the audience who felt dominated by the men in their lives in one direction, to have this fantasy scenario where those same dominating traits were instead projected in the opposite direction would have been very novel and enticing. The final film I want to discuss is All That Heaven Allows, released in 1955, 10 years after the end of the war. The film encapsulates 1950s American culture with its setting of an idyllic suburban neighborhood. And the main character, Carrie, starts off the film as the ideal 1950s woman. But what makes her so compelling, particularly for the female audiences of the time, and I would argue to this day, is that she tests the boundaries of the labels and categories that she has been placed in by social norms as a wife, a widow, a mother, a homemaker, when she falls in love with a working class younger man and finds herself at odds with her family and community. With a script written by Peg Fenwick based on the novel by Edna Lee, despite the influence of women in its production, the film has received criticism from feminist film theorists who particularly take issue with the film's ending. In the film's climactic sequence, the love interest, Ron, is critically injured, and the film ends with Carrie rushing to his bedside, promising to care for him for as long as she needs to, and vowing that nothing, whether it be society, their respective families, or indeed near-death experiences, will keep them apart again. The argument then is that with this ending, with Carrie returning to a sort of carer role, does the film undo some of the more ambitious concepts it explores, with Carrie trying to branch out of such roles that she was in at the beginning of the film as a widow and as a mother? I would argue not. I believe that the film's ending is in fact progressive within the constraints of the culture in which it was made, with this ending meaning that Carrie, so to speak, gets the best of both worlds. She is able to benefit from the younger, handsome, masculine, protective lover, while also in the role of his caregiver, able to establish some equilibrium where she has a degree of power over him, which is in contrast to the one-sided relationship that she has with, for example, her children in the earlier scenes of the film. In conclusion, my aim with this presentation has been to give some insight into the prevalence and influence of women in the film industry during this period, and look into how, by viewing these films as the creations of women, we can better understand why certain plot elements were the way they are, and why perhaps certain elements of these films that we may initially want to dismiss as dated or troubling in some way are in fact were what their appeal was to female audiences at the time. And thank you, and any questions? Thank you.